I gotta say, this is the best question I've received in a long time. So, a very nice name asks, among other things, where should I go to start to learn about the deep left? What video? Of course, I've produced hundreds of videos where I give little bits and pieces, or I might give the whole picture, but it's contained within hours of other content. I used to do really long videos in the past. Obviously, we've tried to move beyond that. Of course, I'm still capable of making 3-hour long videos, but we're experimenting with utility. If something isn't working, or even if it was working, but I just want to develop a different skill. So I've always got to change things up. We're always learning, we're always growing. I'm going to go to my Twitter page here, which is @Jockle on Twitter, JOKKULL. And the pinned tweet here is a 4-part slideshow somebody made for me. I'm very grateful for. We spent actually a lot of time working on the graphic design of this. So I'm just going to read it out to you. I'm going to sneeze, so I'm going to mute the microphone while I sneeze. Maybe if I talk about it enough, I won't sneeze. Okay, I did sneeze. It didn't work. All right. So what is the deep left? The deep left seeks alternatives to capitalism. It views the mainstream left as captured by capitalism. Deep left tripartite analysis compares merchant capitalism with priest/warrior-led systems. The deep left uses minoritarianism rather than populism or nationalism. So you're probably asking, well, okay, what do you mean by capitalism? What do you mean by tripartite analysis? What do you mean by merchant capitalism? What do you mean by the priest? What do you mean by the merchant? Who are these people? And what is minoritarianism as opposed to populism or nationalism? So the minoritarian strategy says that effective identities are minorities, not the vast masses. So if you look at the Eleusinian mystery schools, going back to ancient Egypt, the Egyptian royal family itself, that Babylonian kingship, ancient Chinese statecraft, the Incas, the Aztecs, Native American chieftains, right? Pretty much every society in the world is governed by a small minority of people. In a tribal setting, you might have a tribal leader. I would put forth a theory of governance that the smaller the group is, the more feasible it is for that group to have a truly democratic character. That is, if you have a small group, you can try to take into account and equally weight the opinion of every single person in that group. So if you have 5 people, 10 people, 100 people even, you can try to go around and assess the opinion of everybody in that group and really genuinely make their voice matter, make their vote count in a sense, even though it might not be an official voting system. As soon as you go beyond Dunbar's number, which is psychologically a concept that we can only hold so many names and faces in our head as total recall. Now, of course, that number is subject to criticism. Everyone's different. Some people it's less, some people it's more. But as soon as you go beyond that and you get beyond the tribal level into a small city state, say a few thousand people, 10,000 people or more, you start to get the emergence of minoritarianism, rule by minorities. One of the distinct things about minoritarianism is that it's not simply minority status, right? The Roma people have been minorities in Europe for over 1,000 years. I don't describe them as minoritarians because they are not governing those territories in any sense, or they do not have the priestly or the mercantile or warrior class power. And let's talk about those 3 types of minoritarian strategies, which are not mutually exclusive, but which are distinct. Let's skip to the 3rd slide. So the tripartite class structure. Warriors are engineers and athletes conquering a bodily aesthetic of beauty. Priests are poets, ascetics, celibates, and philosophers rejecting the world to seek God and truth. And merchants are seeking material power through quantity over quality, returning to the insectoid and inorganic. So the reason for the pyramid in this way is warriors here is sort of this whole concept for me became powerfully introduced by thinking about the way that the brain works. Now, our study of neuroscience says essentially there are three major groupings in the brain. Now, there's many little subgroupings and little parts of the brain. The geography of the brain is vast and incredibly more complex than real-life geography, but there are three basic parts, which is you've got your frontal lobe, your prefrontal, so the middle of the brain, and then you've got where it attaches to your spine, your limbic system back there, primitive brain. So the frontal part of the brain, chronologically in our evolutionary history, is the newest part of the brain. Then you've got the middle part of the brain. That's pretty old. We share that with chimpanzees. And then the oldest part of the brain is even older than chimpanzees. And of course, I'm making it sound like we're descended. I know we're not descended from chimpanzees, but in any case, it's a fetal structure. If you look at the development of a fetus in the womb, you can see how a human fetus has a homunculus structure to that of a rabbit or even a fish. That animal fetuses start off looking the same, and as they develop in the womb, they start to differentiate. That's what I mean when I'm comparing these across different species. So when we get to the limbic system, we actually basically share that, again, not identically, but the structure of it, the behavioral functions of the limbic system are pretty much shared with like reptiles, right? So this is a very ancient. So we're talking about frontal lobe. This is structures that we've developed and that have really changed a lot in the last, say, million years. To the development of Homo sapiens sapiens, we're talking about 200,000 years ago, our divergence with Homo neanderthalis or Homo sapiens neanderthalis, depending on how you classify. There's controversy over that. So that is relatively recent. The middle of the brain, that is millions and millions of years old. And as far as the limbic system, we're talking about something that's tens or even hundreds of millions of years old in terms of these basic functions haven't really changed. And so these three parts of the brain basically correspond to these classes. That the warrior class is dealing with the body, and it's dealing with these basic intuitions, fight or flight, sex and violence, these things that are like the mating principle, the killing principle, eros and thanatos. Another person who's really influential on my conception of the warrior class was Freud, and breaking these down. Of course, Freud has the concept of the id, the ego, and the superego, right? So this tripartite class structure is not just made up by, maybe you don't trust neuroscientists, or you think I'm misrepresenting the field, or maybe you don't trust Freud. But this tripartite class structure is encoded within the Indo-European religious structure and linguistic structure. So the Indo-European language family, if you're not familiar, is a grouping of languages based on linguistic ancestry, meaning that we know that English is descended in part from Anglo-Saxon, which is descended from a Proto-Germanic language. And if we continue going backwards in this evolutionary tree of languages, we eventually find that the Germanic languages, the Romance languages, the Celtic languages, the languages of Greek, the Hellenic languages. The Romance languages are actually part of a larger family called the Italic languages. Then you have the Slavic languages, the Baltic languages, I believe, did I mention Armenian, the Armenian language, as well as some extinct languages like the Tocharian language family, and the Avestan and what are called the Indo-Aryan languages that include Hindu or Hindi and Iranian or Farsi. So all of these languages are related by a common linguistic ancestor. And the fact is that in all of these language families, there's an associated culture and an associated religion. And within the mythic structures of those religions, we see this tripartite class structure. And so you can say, well, this is an essentialist structure. You're trying to shoehorn this thing into everything. This is just a neat way to describe the world. It's not accurate. You can say all of that, and of course we could actually get into the weeds of, all right, well, explain to me how it's not accurate. But what I would just say in general is, whether or not you think this is true, just understand that pretty much the most successful culture in history in terms of its qualitative, quantitative spread by almost any metric has this core concept of a tripartite class structure deeply embedded in its cultural, religious, linguistic structures. So to sort of envision a quick lesson in what the warrior class is, examples of that. So a warrior class is basically where we get our concept of personal honor, of friendship, and I would be happy to do a video on that as well, of loyalty, right? The warrior class loves physical beauty and aesthetics. When you look at a grand cathedral or you're listening to classical music was created under the patronage of the warrior class. The palace at Versailles was created by the warrior class. So the warrior class is very interested in the physical. Today, when you're looking around, okay, well, who's part of the warrior class? Well, people are engineers, people are programmers. The warrior class is always asking the question, how? How can I get it done? How can we win the war? How can I get the girl? How can I do this? And therefore, Spangler says that the warrior class is always interested in techniques. Of course, I'm not quoting Spangler there, but I'm kind of inferring from and drawing from him. And Spangler, like Spangler's work on Man and Technics, he's really talking about the warrior class there, that this is, he's not so concerned with the technology, because technology is a product of techniques. Heidegger further draws from Spangler on this and says that the problem of our civilization is techniques itself. But to kind of condense all of that together, what is techniques? Techniques is the technique. It's the way of thinking that allows you to develop technology. So it's the scientific method. It's problem solving. It's being able to look at a mathematical equation and to be creative about it. It's to be able to look at a battlefield and to strategize and use tactics and logistics. And a good warrior is able to use charisma. The warrior is the Chad. He's the most popular guy. He's the captain of the football team, and he is bringing everything together. So these are kind of two separate functions of the warrior that are best when they're combined in a singular person, but often are separated. You can have the person who's kind of antisocial in the basement looking at the math problem, or you can have somebody who is analytically not that bright, but socially they're very intelligent. So that you're really differentiating between a warrior who's specializing in emotional intelligence versus, analytical intelligence. When those are brought together, that's where you get kingship. But moving on to the priests, the poets, the ascetics, celibates, philosophers, they are always asking the question, why? Why do we exist? Why are we here? Why did God create us? Why, why is good good and why is bad bad? So the warriors are not interested in these questions. The warriors are like, I want to blow things up. I want to organize armies. I want to build palaces. I want to ask, how can I get those things done? And the warrior's interested in the process itself. Like Ernst Junger's perspective on warfare is that warfare should not have at its core some kind of humanistic justification, but that war in itself has its own justification because it is representative of the struggle for survival and the question of how are we going to survive. That's why warriors will put themselves in prepping situations, survivalist situations. They like to imagine that the world's going to end because, if technology was eliminated, like Ted Kaczynski would like, then we would return to a warrior-dominant society. But because we don't have that, warriors are being phased out through technology, through drones and other military technologies. The priest is always asking why. And so with the function of the priest ends up being very linguistic, critical of language, lawyers, human resources management, people who are bureaucrats. That's sort of the lower form of the priest. The higher form is like the life coach, the poet, the artist. The priest is communicative. The priest is critical. The priest is refining. The priest is, as before with the warrior, if you have a priest with very low social intelligence, they might just be like a medieval monk who is rewriting copies of the Bible. You had these monks who were spending hours and hours handwriting books of the Bible out over and over again. That is a priestly function. To an extent, you ask, well, where does the line between the warrior function and the priestly function begin and end? I would say it has to do with a relation to the body. It has to do with the fact that the warrior always brings everything back to the concept of a structure, to visualization, to doing, to action, whereas the priest is oriented around abstraction, around pure idea, around the concept of morality. So the warrior is not interested in justifying a moral code. The warrior just says, I know it when I see it and I feel it and it's in my gut and this is wrong and this is right. You can get class overlap. You can get people who emulate both characteristics, right? So these are not mutually exclusive, but they are distinct. I'm going to try to move on here to the merchants. And the merchants are interesting in the way that you can see aspects of the former two classes in them. And I say that the question the merchant is trying to ask is what? So whereas the warrior is content with the how, he's like, I want to make a flamethrower just for the fun of it. I want to make a jetpack because that would be cool. The merchant is saying, well, what's the purpose? How does that give me any gain? How much money am I going to make? So the merchant is very practical, ruthlessly practical. Whereas the warrior enjoys things like athletics and sports because of the feeling that it gives him, how it makes him feel. And the priest rejects that and says, no, we should be, honoring God or writing long effort posts on Twitter. The merchant says, you both are wasting your time. Who cares how, athletics makes you feel? And if they do engage in athletics, it's purely pragmatic. It's purely, I will engage in 30 minutes of light exercise a day because the doctor recommended it. So the merchants are basically the people who are best at making money for the most part, at least on average. If you look at investment analysts, investment bankers, people who manage stock portfolios, this is the best way to make money because they are not concerned with how they're making money. When I go to people and I talk with them and I say, hey man, how would you like to make a bunch of money? It almost sounds like I'm pitching some kind of scam or pyramid scheme here. But if I say if you want to trade money on the stock market or crypto or whatever, you can make a lot of money. And I know people who are making thousands of dollars a day doing very few hours of work a day, although it takes a lot of research in the beginning. But they're making enormous amounts of money with no capital. Capital meaning they don't have a factory, they don't have workers, they don't have employees, they don't have any structure. They just have a laptop and they're trading things on the market, these digital currencies. And usually the priest will say, I don't want to waste my life on material things. I'm focused on something higher, my ideology or God or my artwork. The warrior will say, that seems parasitical, that seems evil, that seems mercantile, right? I don't like that. I want to do something concrete with my life. I want to do something where I can really see the value of my labor. I want to see something cool, whether it's a computer program running or a video game or chemical engineering or whatever it is. I want to really see and feel and touch and taste what it is that I'm doing, which is why a lot of warriors are appeal to farming, right? But the merchant says, I don't care. I don't care about God. I don't care about how it makes me feel. What makes me feel good is just having a lot of money. I like having money. I like having power. And it's addictive. It's like gambling, except these people are very safe. They're very much against the concept of taking risks. They're very calculating. They're very careful. And when we look at these three classes, we can see that the domination of each class is also reflected in three structures of civilization that are related to three structures of consciousness. So as I'm saying a bunch of word salad here, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who came up with the concept of the consciousness structure. So consciousness structure, probably should go to bed soon, right? If I can't, Gebser, okay. He's not even on the page. Look, I remembered it all by myself. I just had to, sometimes I need to physically type something out to remember it. So Jean Gebser came up with this concept of the consciousness structures. He says there's a magical, a mythic, and a mental consciousness structure. He says that there's going to be a fourth one called an integral consciousness structure. We're not going to get into that. But basically, the magical consciousness structure is basically you're living life as if you're dreaming all the time. This is related to the bicameral mind. I think that's William Joyce. While I'm here, I might as well. Bicameral mind. I might be spelling things wrong. Yeah, whatever. Okay. Julian Jaynes, right. So Julian Jaynes came up with the concept of the bicameral mind, where he looks at ancient Greek literature like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he says, these people were schizophrenics. These people, like when we say, God spoke to me, usually we mean that as a metaphor. Most people, like, I don't know about you, but I don't walk around hearing the voice of God all the time. And if someone said, if you were forced to talk about hearing the voice of God, how would you use that phrase? I'd use it metaphorically, right? But what he argued is that the Greeks were constantly hearing voices in their head. That is, the waking state and the dreaming state were not as differentiated as they are. And I believe that's what is meant by bicameral. Cameral is like the two different sides of the brain, and that separation between them. I could be totally butchering that, but in any case, that's the basic thesis. And so I think that is a good explanation or good interpretation of what Jean Gebser means when he says the magical consciousness structure. And this is kind of, you'd think that this is sort of priestly because this is like a schizophrenic kind of mode. And there could be an argument for that. It was a more religious time, but the religion was much more pagan, pantheistic. People worshipped stones and rocks and trees. A lot of times when people talk about this, and I'm trying to remember the other dude. I mean, just to give a sources cited here, I got a lot of this info from John David Ebert, who unfortunately he doesn't want to be part of the deep left, but I did basically steal all of his ideas. None of these are original ideas from me. But maybe I'm not running out of people to name drop, but I'm forgetting the names of people to name drop. In any case, to move this discussion along, the movement from, I was talking about the schizophrenia, that everything is embodied, everything is purposeful, everything is sacred, everything has meaning. And there's not this distinction between that which is spiritual and that which is material. And so everything in itself has value. And this is how the warrior looks at the world, is that a good, beautiful program has value in itself. A good, beautiful robot has value in itself. A good, beautiful car has value in itself. So a good way to determine if someone's part of the warrior class is, are they really into cars? Not to say that the merchant class can't also buy fancy cars, right, as a status symbol to make themselves feel good. But the merchant class, they're not mechanics. That's the differentiation you have to understand. The merchant class is happy to buy things that the warrior class makes as a status symbol, as a symbol of power. But the merchant class doesn't enjoy getting on their hands and their knees with wrenches and grease. The warrior class loves to do that, and therefore the warrior class worships objects. The warrior class is paganistic. And the warrior class is the class of magic. Whereas the priest class is the class of myth, because myth deals with metalinguistic structures. What I mean by that is when you study linguistics, you're going to find that there are these things called phonemes and morphemes. A phoneme is a basic unit of sound, like m, k, d, These are basic units of sound that are basically irreducible. You can't make them any simpler. And we combine them to make words. And morphemes are products of phonemes that actually start to have meaning, like cat. So cat is a product of the k, a, and t sounds. So you combine those together to make cat. Now a morpheme actually has meaning. And you can string morphemes together to make sentences. The cat runs fast, okay? Now we have cat as a noun, runs as a verb, fast as an adverb. And we're starting to make sentence structures. The cat runs fast. There's no real morality behind the cat runs fast. You could reference generative anthropology to then look at classifications of statements ranging from the ostensive, you're just sort of gesturing and you're like, cat runs fast. You're just kind of like, look at that cat's running fast. Moving over into the imperative of run fast, cat, run fast. You're telling the cat, now it's like a morality thing, you should do this. And then finally, descriptive, the cat runs fast, which we view as the most basic, but which in generative anthropology they said that is actually not really how human language develops. And that tripartite structure in generative anthropology could be compared to some of the things I'm talking about here. But I'm throwing out a lot. Let's take a deep breath. Can we take a water break? Is the water break active? Okay. All right. That's my attempt at the water break. I didn't actually take a water break because I don't have water around me. Okay. So we're talking about the structure of language. Would everybody just leave me alone? Right. I'm trying to make a video. Okay. We're shutting the phone off. You're done. I'm cutting these people off. I'll talk to you later. All right. We'll turn that off. Sorry. This video is a mess. Okay, so we were talking about GA, right? And the reason we're talking about GA is because we're talking about morphemes and phonemes. And so we just described 3 types of sentence structure: an ostensive, gestural, pointing at things, and that gets into sign language and body language and all sorts of other things. But in terms of the imperative and the declarative, that a mythological structure basically describes a field of archetypes. And these archetypes are personalities or personages which have characteristics. Like, you're going to have the archetype of the king, and the king is going to have certain qualities of masculinity. He's going to have certain qualities of temperance or something like that. He's going to have a Jupiterian quality. He's going to have a certain age to him. Now, all of that is assuming a lot of stuff. It's assuming a patriarchal understanding of kingship. And all of that is particular to certain cultures, the Semitic culture, the Indo-European culture. It's not universal throughout all human groups, right? So the mythic concept of the king that we might think of as, because we're sort of like a fish in water, we think of the concept of a king as a universal concept, but it's really a particular technology that was invented. Like myths are a technology that are invented to moralize people, to view certain archetypes as natural and normal, like the archetype of marriage is a mythic structure that one man, one woman get together, the two are made one, they're inseparable until death do you part. Right now, that mythic structure has come under attack because we have mythic revolutions that get into religion. So religion is a composite of myths. So we can see how we have basic linguistic structures, morphemes, phonemes, sentences, ostensive. Did I say descriptive? I meant declarative. Okay, just turn off the video. I'm getting everything wrong. Okay, ostensive, imperative, declarative, right? And then those structures are making up archetypes, which are the chess pieces within a chess game of myths, and mythic structures together that are interwoven in a way that has a certain level of coherence and interdependence, although sometimes there are contradictions, but that rises to the level of a cult or a religion. In polytheistic times, in the ancient Middle East especially, because that's where we have all these written records and we can look back and try to understand it historically, is each city-state had its own religious makeup, but that these were basically, to the extent that they were not monotheistic, I mean, every city-state had a chief god or goddess. Like Athens had Athena and Sparta had Apollo. Each of the ancient Middle Eastern cities had their own Baal, Marduk, whoever. Osiris, Ra, Seth, Horus. So all of these ancient cities had a chief god, but then because people would travel around, we think migration is a modern concept. It only takes a couple months to walk around the world. That's an exaggeration, but if you're on horseback like the Indo-Europeans with your chariots, it really only takes a few months to travel from, ancient Ireland to ancient India. If you're really determined and you have a good map. Now, people didn't always have that, so it would take years. But people live for decades, right? So over the course of decades, you can have huge population transfers from Africa to Europe to Asia and all over the place. Needless to say, there was a lot of migration. There were people going from city to city. And there was, therefore, a polytheism about that because you had all these competing religions, and they then had to create constant renewals of syncretism of, okay, well, your chief goddess is going to marry my chief god, and then those systems became integrated, and now we have a pantheon. Now it's not just your god and my god, but it's a pantheon. There's kind of a chicken and egg question here of which came first, monotheism or polytheism, in the way that I'm describing it. Because of the basic family structure, I'm inclined to say that polytheism was invented first, but that there's a kind of positive feedback loop between the two in which you create a structure where you say that, well, Athena is the daughter of Zeus or something like that. None of these gods really exist in isolation. That is, until Judaism with Yahweh. We switch from monolatry, which is you have one god that you worship. You believe that other gods are real in some sense, but you only worship one. To now you're saying all the other gods are fake and they don't exist. They're idols. Yahweh is the one true God. So now we get into the concept of truth. All right, and that is prefigured by the Zoroastrians, who created a dualism in which they declared that all of the Devis were devils. Devi is actually a cognate with Latin deus, which, is still used in the Catholic Church for God, right? So in the religion of the Zoroastrians, they took all of the gods and they just started calling them demons and devils, which is kind of an incredible religious revolution, similar to how with BLM, or the corporate left today, they will say that all of your Confederate heroes, all of your presidents, all your founding fathers, they were evil devils. That's basically what Zoroaster did, and that's what Zoroastrianism did. People like to criticize Christianity on these grounds for being revolutionary and attacking paganism, but of course, that critique of Christianity is related to Nietzsche, who praised Zoroaster. So there's a lot of interesting conflict in here that it may be tempting to go off into one side or the other. I don't think it's that easy. So we move from the mythic or the magical to the mythic consciousness structure. And then we move out of that into the mental consciousness structure. And the mental consciousness basically is a completion of a process where in the magical consciousness, there's no differentiation between the waking state and the dreaming state. You're constantly in a state of metaphor and intuition, and everything is spiritual, everything is significant, everything is magical, everything's talking to you all the time. You're hearing the voice of the gods. To mythical, okay, some people can hear the voice of God, but those people are special priests. They have to go in the woods. They don't eat for 40 days. They're taking drugs or whatever. The shaman class, they can hear the gods, but you can't. And then finally, in the mental consciousness structure, we just wipe out that function entirely. We say magic is dead, magic is fake, this is new atheism. And again, this is prefigured. You can see it in monotheism of Zoroaster, of the cult of Aten-Ra in Egypt. And then, Freud says Moses the Egyptian got his concept of Judaism from those monotheistic Egyptians. Pythagoras talks about the one, right? So this is an ancient idea that probably predates Judaism, but Judaism is, I believe Arthur Toynbee called Judaism the archaic form, or I don't know exactly what term he used. There is a term, not homunculus structures, not archaic structures. There's a term for your appendix. These are organs that no longer have a purpose, although your appendix does have a purpose. It actually stores good bacteria. But in any case, he describes basically that Judaism gives us a snapshot into the past. It's a living tradition that hasn't died, that is representative of one religious form among many religious forms at that time who are engaging in religious revolutions. And Judaism's decision to negate all of the other gods, to destroy the concept of pantheon, replace it with monotheism, is a move away from the mythic structure that I talked about of various archetypes and so on. Judaism has archetypes, but it's still symbolically moving toward the mental consciousness structure where you're eliminating the sacredness of those things. You're eliminating a bodily conception that the gods have bodies. Now the gods are myths. Now the gods are rationalistic. The concept of science has been deified in our culture. So that's the example of a mental consciousness structure. It doesn't mean that any of these things are wrong, by the way. I'm comparing and contrasting them. But I think there's a sense in which our intuitions are real. I think there's a sense in which myths are real. And I think there's a sense in which logic and reason and science is real. So when I kind of try to flip these concepts on their head, and when you put one object in the language of another object, that is, if I describe the merchant class according to the warrior class, or the priest class according to the merchant class, or whatever, it sounds kind of derogatory and dismissive, because the one class, from one class to another, their function is obscure because there's a different will behind each of these classes. The warrior is willing to self-sacrifice to an extent, but he's also looking for glory. The priest is looking to self-sacrifice, not for his glory, but for the glory of God, being completely self-sacrificing, and a very different perspective on the ego. whereas the merchant doesn't want to sacrifice anything, doesn't care about God, doesn't care about glory, just wants to survive, just wants power and the concentration thereof. So that is enough about the tripartite class system. I hope that gives you a peek or a window into what minority groups might look like. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, to the concept of, why do we call it the deep left as opposed to the deep right or something? Well, we're critiquing capitalism, and capitalism here is putting profit and selfishness over self-sacrifice. It is encouraging consumerism to perpetuate addiction, and this worship of money is a death cult. So the system of capitalism has to be contextualized as it started off, and let's go back to our tripartite class analysis here. So, like I said, there was a period in which the warrior class was dominant. The priest class has also at times been dominant, especially in India with the Brahmin. The merchant class starts to seek dominance because of technological revolutions in Europe. So, for example, book production in the 12th century Renaissance goes way up. This is then followed by the Black Death, which wipes out 30% of the population. You have a labor shortage that changes the economic structures of feudal Europe, where peasants have more purchasing power or ability to negotiate with their employers, the lords, who then have a reaction to that. It opens up new religious space because the church is shaken by this mass death, this mass calamity of apocalyptic proportions. I mean, if there was a disease that was killing 30% of people, that would change the world forever. So it did, right? Because what immediately followed the Black Death was the Renaissance. And I'd love to do more videos on that as well, of how the Renaissance was immediately put forth as a pagan revival, as a revival of classical Greece and Rome, that the originators of the Renaissance, the first medieval people to use the term Renaissance and to put that forth, referenced figures like Apollo. They invoked those gods in their development of this new movement. So it was a very conscious thing. It was not this accidental thing of like, we found some old Greek poetry and that kind of inspired us subconsciously. No, it was like they were reading this and they're like, we need to recreate Plato's Academy. We need to bring back the worship of these gods. Now, the way that they negotiated that, because this was very obviously heretical to Christianity, so the way they negotiated that is there was a bifurcated response to, or a bifurcated paganistic strategy, I guess. And I compare this today to nationalism versus minoritarianism, that the quote-unquote nationalists or majoritarians were people like the Cathars and the Bogomils. These were poor people. These were common people. They weren't very smart. And they would take over areas of southern France. They would take over areas of Romania or wherever. And they would set up renegade churches where they would do things, group marriage and vegetarianism, all these weird kind of heresies in the eyes of the Catholic Church, at least. And they would be subject to crusades. We always think about the crusades being in the Middle East or even in northeastern Europe, crusades in the Teutonic Knights. But huge numbers of crusades were launched in southern France against the Cathars. So that was a strategy that ended in the Cathars being wiped out or at least driven underground. So it wasn't a very successful strategy, at least not on the surface. But the successful strategy was the alchemists and the astrologers. These were people who clearly had mythic, magical, whatever kind of religious structure you want to classify. They had spiritual systems that were outside of the Bible, that came from a different source. And they managed to survive because they appealed to the protection of the warrior class. And when you look at someone like Tycho Brahe, and I'm going to remember the name of this monarch, Rudolf II. So Rudolf II, one of the main architects of the Renaissance, very conscious about it as well. Again, people love to use the term conspiracy as something dark. Oh, he conspired. It was like a spiraling down. this isn't conspiracy. This is cooperation. This is conscious cooperation. This is planning. I mean, we have to come up with a better term than conspiracy, really. This is people being like, yeah, let's make paganism great again. Let's bring it back. Rudolf II introduced a lot of concepts of religious tolerance into Europe. He really didn't care who was. This was in the context of, like the 30 Years' War, of 30% of the population after the Black Death dying because of religious warfare. And he said, I don't care if you're Catholic or Protestant or Jewish. This is where you get the start of people like the Freemasons, right, who feel very similar to Rudolf II. I wouldn't be surprised if he was a Freemason, although people say Freemasons weren't that old, but I'm sure he was starting secret societies that influenced the later development of the Freemasons. So he was sponsoring people like Tycho Brahe and who were around the same time as Galileo. These people are looking at the stars and they're disrupting. Okay, I thought I told you guys to stop. So he's sponsoring all these people who are disrupting the traditional astrological or astronomical views of the church. And it's an interesting thing, especially if you look at someone like, I've always admired Isaac Newton since I was a really little kid. I did like a book report on him, and I always loved Isaac Newton. Something people don't know about Isaac Newton is he was an extremely fanatical Christian. Like, he loved reading the Bible, but he was also an occultist, and he was an astrologer, and he was an alchemist, but he was also a really good scientist. So we often think that all of these things are mutually exclusive, but they're not. And Rudolf II was a mystic. He believed in all sorts of crazy things, but he also funded the development of very legit science in Europe. So all of this is going to produce capitalism, because all these changes, the reason why I'm talking about all these changes, you're like, okay, he's just gone off on a rant. But the reason I'm talking about all of this is because all of these monumental changes to the religious fabric of Europe and economic and everything else, they create openings, right? They create vacuums. They create spaces where the traditional class structures of Europe, the traditional aristocrats and elites, they don't know how to deal with certain things. And there are new opportunities for a merchant class. And the merchant class comes in, and I say the seminal moment for the creation of capitalism in Europe, I talked about the Black Death, but for me, a decisive moment was when Henry VIII dissolved the properties of the Catholic Church. This is during, the Anglican Revolution in Europe, in England, where the Catholic Church doesn't want to grant him a divorce, and so he says, I'll create my own church. And people think, oh, that was kind of silly or selfish or whatever, but it really has far-reaching consequences, because the Catholic Church owned a lot of land, a lot of properties. You think about how many people go to church in England. Like everybody, right? Everybody goes to church. And so there's a church on literally every corner, and people don't have cars. And so there's like one church per 100 people. You think about there's, however many hundreds of thousands of people living in England at the time, so there are thousands and thousands of churches, really big churches with some nice property, because these churches were self-sufficient. They would have monks living on them and adjacent monasteries, and they would have wine vineyards, and they would have agriculture to support themselves. They weren't just living off tithes, right? These were not the selfish parasites that anti-clerical people like to make them out to be. They were producing a lot of things economically. And so all of a sudden, Henry VIII just confiscated all this property, which is really incredible if you think about it. And he started to say, well, how are we going to redistribute this? And he said, well, I need money, so whoever wants to buy the land can have it. Now, to you and I, this is just, yeah, of course, you buy real estate. Like, that's just one of the most basic forms of investment ever. This was revolutionary because at that time, property was alloidial. Alloidial meaning that if you owned property in Europe, it was because your dad owned property in Europe. And what you could do with that property is you could die, and you could give it to your firstborn son in a practice known as primogeniture. Primo meaning first, geniture meaning, your child, essentially, generation. So this was completely and totally interrupted by the fact that all of a sudden now you could just buy land. This took a whole class of people who were shoemakers, people who were travelers, spice traders, whoever, lawyers, professionals, like people who were not warriors, people who were not priests, people who were merchants, for the first time ever had the ability to buy land. And this allowed them to be ennobled, because what we don't understand is that the difference between a noble and a peasant in medieval Europe was whether or not you owned land. That was the key distinction. So if you were knighted, if you were just some dude, you were a peasant or whatever, and you found your way into a military campaign for whatever reason, and you performed well in battle, you might get knighted. And when you got knighted, you got a piece of land. They would give you a piece of land. And then you would pass that land on throughout all the generations. And the idea is that keeps in. So there's a certain stagnancy to the system. There's a certain level of meritocracy as well. I mean, you could lose your land if you don't have any descendants, or if you marry into another family, it gets transferred to that family, because it's not transferred via women, it's transferred via men. So if a woman marries a man and she's the sole descendant, then all of her land goes to that man's family, right? But now merchants can buy into this. And this is a different type of meritocracy than getting it through warfare or getting it through the Catholic Church. Very different moral system, very different worldview that animates the merchant class. This creates capitalism, and this creates all the changes that people talk about today, whether it's feminism, mass immigration, Hollywood, all the technology we have is a product of capitalism, right? So capitalism is very powerful, and basically what capitalism means is you're able to trade goods and services like land or property without any warrior or priestly considerations involved. And basically capitalism creates these property rights that says, you don't have to have any sort of warrior courage or honor or skill. You don't have to have any kind of priestly training or spiritual knowledge. You just have to be able to get together enough money through theft, through bargaining, through whatever you need to do, sales tactics, snake oil salesman tactics, diamond selling, whatever you need to do. That is how you can get land. So this is basically, capitalism says that all property is fungible. That is not the opinion of the warrior class. That's not the opinion of the priest class. So fundamentally, capitalism is not an economic system. Capitalism is a concept of spirituality. Capitalism is a concept of property. Capitalism is a concept of governance, and the economics are what follows. So we understand that capitalism is dissolving everything in its path, and now it's dissolving the middle class. I would say it's dissolving humanity itself, because with artificial intelligence and genetic research, we're on the cusp of creating new species. We probably already have. They're just secret in a lab somewhere. We don't know about them. But this is the future we're facing, and the deep left is just creating an awareness of all these problems and trying to take a step deeper, trying to think deeper and understanding, okay, we are not in the establishment. If you're not part of the billionaire class, if you're not part of the managerial class, if you're not some kind of functionary for the system, or if you're not ruling the system, then you're kind of on the outside of the system. You're on the periphery of the system, and you are incurring the costs. When we go to war with Afghanistan, the people who get hurt from that are the Afghani people and the American people. But when people say, oh, we lost Afghanistan, no, you lost Afghanistan. It was your tax dollars. It was inflation harming you to pay for the war, but it didn't harm the billionaire class. They profited off of it, and their managerial class, the people who administer society on their behalf, the politicians, the lawyers, to an extent the police as a force, they all benefited, right? Military-industrial complex benefited. So we have to recognize this. We have to recognize the structure for what it is, how it came to be, because any critique of the system is going to be completely wrong-headed and a waste of time, or even worse, it's going to get you doxxed. It's going to ruin your life. If you have a bad understanding of the system, if you think black black people did this, or it was the Jews. If you have a really simple-minded ethnic hatred that animates your political system, or if you're like, oh, we just need to go back to nationalism. I didn't really have time to go into that, but a short version of that is nationalism is a creation of the merchant class to attack the monarchy as well as the church. And I can go into that in another video if you want. But yeah, none of the solutions that the dissident right is offering are valid. They're all very bad. They're come up with people who have high analytical intelligence, who are able to manipulate concepts and use big words and cite authors in the same way that I've done. But they don't have a deeper understanding. They don't understand context. They don't have discernment. They don't have wisdom. They don't really know their history. They don't even know the history of the dissident right. And obviously mainstream politics are unsatisfactory because the mainstream is just propaganda for the billionaire class. And so they'll tell you that, you should eat a bunch, you should eat a bunch of grain all the time. You should eat corn syrup, and you should have sucralose, or whatever it's called, the chlorinated form of sugar. I mean, diet for me is the biggest wake-up call to, we are being poisoned. And so, we can't trust the mainstream in that sense. That's not to say that everything the mainstream says is wrong. Like, I love science. I think evolution is true. But obviously the mainstream is flawed, and I'm not just going to be a radical centrist, because centrism is just taking neoconservatism and neoliberalism and saying, I agree with both of them 50% of the time. Okay, obviously that's not even real, right? Even if you could somehow lower yourself morally to accept that kind of position, it is not true, right? It's full of lies. I'd say, again, we have to divest from the black and white thinking that says if our enemies say something, it's false. No matter how crazy somebody is, usually they can tell you the sky is blue. So to sum it up, because I'm definitely not going to go over an hour here, the deep left is trying to be anti-ideological, post-ideological, is trying to make people think, is trying to make people understand these concepts, basic concepts that I think are simple enough to be put in a 3-slide slideshow here. And, yes, it did take me an hour to explain this. What I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to explain this to someone who's a bit less long-winded than I am, who could condense like an hour-long video into a 15-minute video. And then this sort of idea would gain some traction. I'm not look, to give you like the inside baseball, I've chosen the deep left as a branding for the channel, in direct opposition to the dissident right. And the reason for that is because I look at people who are in the mainstream as NPCs, right? They pretty much, they're living their life, they're living the best life, YOLO, whatever. And there's not really much I have to offer those people. People who are in the dissident right, I believe, I sympathize with the suffering that they feel, the alienation that they feel. And I think, a true Marxist would agree with me here that just because people have bad ideas doesn't mean that it's their fault, and we can try to understand why they have come to those bad ideas. Where I disagree with the Marxist is in their majoritarian analysis, saying that the workers can unite to govern themselves. Minoritarianism is in contrast to that. So I think I'm going to end the video there. If you have further questions, please ask them. I'm going to try to answer people's questions. If you post comments that are cogent and broken up into paragraphs, like this one, can I switch back to this just to show you guys how good of a comment this was? Look, so it's like he comments on the video, gives like personal, he's like, here's how I'm doing in my life and things I've been trying, and then then he gives a like basically 1 sentence length question. He gives a very respectful, look at, you guys have to go back to medieval manuscripts to realize how people used to write to each other. This is it's just a nice way to ask a question. Where should I start learning about the deep left? What video? Just a perfect exemplar comment. So, if you want me to make a video in response to one of your comments, I'm getting a lot of these. I don't want to use the term schizophrenic because that's, insulting and offensive. I'm not going to use that term. But I'm getting these wall text comments that's just like you're on your iPhone and you're just typing. You don't realize how long it is. And you just put forth this string of text where I have no clue what the point of your comment is. I have no clue that if you can hold a coherent thought or not. My eyes glaze over because I get about 10 of these a day. Well, as you know, I'm getting all these messages and notifications. I'm getting distracted. If you leave the most important sentence, the most important question at the end as a standalone paragraph, then I can say, oh, okay, this person has a point. Like, they're not just spewing nonsense or a journal entry, or like sometimes people make comments where they're like in real time responding to the video, and they're like thinking things through, and they're saying contradictory things from the start to the finish, and you don't know what part is their position or if they're asking a question at all. And that's fine. Like, feel free to use the comments section in that way should you so choose. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's just not going to warrant a video response from me. So this is the ideal comment that inspired this video. Thank you. Very nice name. Appreciate you. Appreciate everybody. Thank you for in advance liking the video, doing a comment, even if it's just like hey, I like this video. I think actually, hey, Abago, thank you, Abago. Thank you for saying you like the video. Yeah, you can just say I like the video. That helps the algorithm. If you message me on Twitter and say, hey, I liked your video, I might not even see that, and it doesn't help the algorithm. So if you want to help the algorithm, comment, I like the video. Thumbs up the video, obviously. That's going to help get us exposure, help us get more people on board. I'm always looking for people who have skills or people who are just human beings who, want to have friends and whatnot, get away from extremist ideology and get toward, okay, what can I do in my own personal life to figure out why am I here? What are we doing? What class am I in? What's the purpose of my life? And maybe you already know it, and maybe you just need some people to help you out. But anyway, what else should you do besides liking and commenting? You can follow me on Twitter at Jockkull, Jokkkull. You can subscribe if you haven't already. You can share the video on any social media platform. I don't know, Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, Discord. I don't know what people use these days. That's it. That's the video. We went 3 minutes over. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.